Fellow citizens, welcome to this Democracy Forum. My name is Tim Kipp, a member of the forum and tonight's moderator. The Democracy Forum is the brainchild of the venerable Woody Bernhardt of Marlborough, Vermont. Woody's idea was to celebrate and analyze the state of democracy in the US, and that's what we've been endeavoring to do for about 5 years. And we have been presenting critical perspectives on democracy from both historical and contemporary vantages. Our interpretations go beyond the mainstream, beyond a liberal complaint to a radical democratic socialist analysis. Tonight, Nick Biddle will examine the trajectory of the Republican Party from the post-World War era to now, World War II, that is. I guess I'm old enough to have to clarify that. His talk is entitled Racism, Secrecy, Lies, and the Ascent of Donald Trump. Nick is a retired professor of Latin American history, a lifelong political activist, and the co-founder of the Democracy Forum. And before we begin, I would like to give a shout out to Star Electronica and the Brooks Memorial Library for hosting this event. And with that, we welcome you all, and here's Nick.
Thank you, everyone, both in the room and out there in cyberspace. So this is called Racism, Secrecy, Lies, and the Ascent of Donald Trump. And I'm going to start with secrecy and move from there into racism, and we'll get to the lies soon thereafter. World War II ended when the United States dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. The death toll and devastation of those 2 nuclear bombs had never been imagined and remained unimaginable even to those who arrived afterward to mop up. As he watched the first nuclear test explosion in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, the lead scientist of the Manhattan Project, Robert Oppenheimer, uttered a Hindu scripture: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." 2 months later, Japan having surrendered, President Truman and his cabinet debated how to proceed with their newly acquired force of destruction. The central question was whether to hold on to it, attempt to monopolize it, and thereby use it as to wield geopolitical power, or divulge its makeup, disarm it, and enjoin the world to eradicate any and all efforts to reproduce atomic weaponry. Secretary of State Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, rather, Henry Stimson, and Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson were forceful opponents for the latter course. Of course, the bear in the room, pun intended, was Russia, then called the Soviet Union. The US and USSR, but already their armies stood toe to toe in Berlin, readying for invasion by the other. The debate lasted several weeks. Dean Acheson argued that the science of nuclear bomb was published material and could not conceivably be contained as a secret. The choice was clear: either share nuclear technology with Russia so that jointly the 2 nations could take measures to prevent bomb production, or become hoarders of military secrets. Following that line of action, Acheson warned, guaranteed Russia's isolation and hostility in the face of prima facie evidence of Anglo-American combination against them. In short, it guaranteed a race to nuclear supremacy and a world in which, quote, there will be no organized peace, but only an armed truce. The advantage to being ahead in such a race, Atchison implored, is nothing compared to not having the race. War hawks and proud nationalists in the cabinet and in Congress overwhelmed Atchison's prescient warning, and the United States started its career as a hoarder of military secrets. A national security state quickly flourished in the wake of that decision. The CIA became a core component. Many volumes have been written on the subterfuge employed in the fabrication and management of the agency. Two cardinal rules operate within it. National Security Council Directive 268, originally authorizing covert actions in July 1948, mandated the first rule. The maxim is that, quote, all activities conducted pursuant to this directive be planned and executed so that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to unauthorized persons, and that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them. This is called plausible deniability, and it is a primary tenet, not just of the CIA, but throughout the apparatus of the national security state. The politics of hoarding military secrets using deniable covert actions as enforcement is, needless to say, wholly undemocratic. A decade ago, the preeminent historian Gary Wills wrote a short book about those politics called Bomb Power. He writes, quote, "The state riddled with illegalities from the outset. It was in multiple ways unaccountable to Congress or the people, was secret and secretly funded, resorting to subversions, sabotage, and assassination. It may be said, it has been said, that all governments do these things, but the United States had not done so in any systematic way before the period after World War II. And other countries do not have the United States Constitution. Accountability is the essence of democracy. If people do not know what their government is doing, they cannot be truly self-governing." There are two salient points in Will's summary. The first is that the national security state is, quote, secretly funded. The history of its secret funding is well documented in terms of secrecy, but not in terms of amounts. To understand why secret budget amounts are rarely exposed, when you get on the web and read the federal government's, quote, classified information non-disclosure agreement.
Nick, I'm sorry to interrupt,
Yes,
but everybody's muted but you. Something you're doing is making a lot of noise.
something is making noise.
Something that you're doing is making a lot of noise because
Okay.
everybody's muted.
Let me
I don't
see.
know what it is.
If I don't touch the stand, maybe that'll help. Does that help? Yes, says Ned. Okay. Essentially, divulging the CIA's actual budget or the Pentagon's full budget is an act of treason. This is the second cardinal rule for the NSS, National Security State. Those who are part of it may never talk about it, and that includes members of Congress, the executive, and their staffs. This means that Congress can never disclose, and the American people cannot know how much is and from what sources come the CIA's and the Pentagon's full budgets. Will's second salient point follows, namely that accountability is the essence of democracy. And if people do not know what their government is doing, they cannot be truly self-governing. The consequences of this truth are staggering and extraordinarily compounded. A few years ago, in a unique moment of unattended blowback to Republican debt politics, Congress ordered the Pentagon to do its first ever audit. Completed in early July 2016, covering fiscal 2015, the Inspector General of the Department of Defense released a cover letter to the audit on July 26, 2016. In it, he stated that the Army and Defense Finance and Accounting Service, quote, did not adequately support $2.8 trillion in third quarter adjustments and $6.5 trillion in year-end adjustments made to the Army General Fund. That is to say, the Army did not account for $8.3 trillion in fiscal 2015. Did a single politician say a word? No. The congressionally allocated budget for the Army in 2015 was $122 billion. 8 trillion, 122 billion. In an overall Pentagon budget of $850 billion. The misstatement or non-accounting of $8.3 trillion is nearly 1,000-fold corruption of funding. Forbes magazine published 3 follow-up articles on the audit discrepancy, discovering not just $8.3 trillion unaccounted for dollars, but over 20 years from 1998 to 2018, 21 trillion in so-called adjustments. Let me point out that in 2018, the total national debt of the United States government was $21 trillion. The Forbes articles elicited one congressional reaction. In late October 2018, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted the following: 21 trillion of Pentagon financial transactions could not be traced, documented, or explained. 21 trillion in Pentagon accounting errors. Medicare for all costs 32 trillion. That means 66% of Medicare for all could have been funded already by the Pentagon. AOC's remonstrance gained no traction. Efforts to get the Office of the Inspector General to explain their audit resulted in deafening silence, followed months later by a statement from the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board that the Pentagon is allowed, quote, to misstate and move funds in order to hide expenditures if it is deemed necessary for the national security purposes. What is a democracy to do? AOC's engagement with the Pentagon budget did not technically violate national security confidentiality because the Department of Defense itself released the audit admitting the 8.3 trillion in unaccountable funds. Had she divulged information known to senators or congressmen on appropriation committees, she would have been arrested. Senator Bernie Sanders knows those figures and much more. Bernie is the primary advocate of Medicare for all, but he does not say what he knows about the national security state budget. When promoting Medicare for all, reporters and Republicans always ask how he would pay for it. He uniformly replies that it is unacceptable to him that the richest country on earth cannot afford health care for its people. That's as far as he goes. It's enough for many of us, but it isn't fully persuasive because it doesn't answer the question. Moreover, many who support Medicare for all, student debt forgiveness, and a $15 minimum wage become cynical. One sarcastic comment to a recent Bernie tweet about Medicare is emblematic. Yeah, but then how do we fund the military complex and line the pockets of elected officials? America has other priorities. We, the people, ain't one of them. There's way too much truth in that. The Citizens United Supreme Court decision of 2010, as we all know, culminated the corporate capture of the American political system. Senators and congresspeople in both parties, but overwhelmingly in the Republican Party, depend upon corporate funds to get elected and reelected. A large portion of those funds come from corporations within the military industrial complex. Corporations like Halliburton, Koch Industries, Bechtel, Exxon, and on and on. Corporate support for Republicans and Democrats like Joe Manchin reinforce the national security state dictum, not only to stay silent about Pentagon and CIA budgets, but also about what they pay for, such as the killing of women and children by US drones in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen, or massive mercenary forces in Iraq. Democrats are tongue-tied, even Democrats like Bernie Sanders. On the other hand, Republicans are licensed to attack Democrats who might speak to murderous imperial injustices. They attack them as unpatriotic or worse. Republicans are very good at attacking Democrats, but what are they good at promoting? The politics of racism leads to answering that question. The most overarching element of American history is racism. It is and has been the fulcrum of American politics, historically and organizationally. From the 3/5 Amendment to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Southern Strategy, and now Trumpism, racism is and has been the primary motive force of action and change. When Barack Obama, James Baldwin, or Langston Hughes have spoken of the Declaration of Independence, the promise of equality between peoples of all shapes, sizes, and colors, the promise in the eyes of the Creator, all people are created equal, they conjure a vector of positivity reflected in the Emancipation Proclamation, the 14th and 15th Amendments, and the Civil Rights Act. These legal proclamations were positive refutations of the hegemonic substratum of racism that precipitated their passage. And each and every measure, whether constitutional amendment or federal law, has failed to eradicate or even fundamentally alter the racist compulsion strewn throughout American society from 1619 to now. For that we are ashamed, as we should be, but we have not been ashamed enough, and I include myself. Remember, Democrats had been the party of racism since the 1830s, spurring formation of the Republican Party in 1854 and leading the way to secession and the Civil War 7 years later. Democrats forced a bloody end to Reconstruction and institutionalized Jim Crow. Institutionalized Jim Crow in the aftermath. Democrats in the South remained committed to segregation and other rules of Jim Crow right into and after passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. They called themselves Dixiecrats. President Lyndon Johnson, a Texas Democrat with a long racist and segregationist history, championed the Civil Rights Act for any number of political and legacy reasons. But he did so under no illusions. Hours after he signed the Civil Rights Act, LBJ said to his press secretary, Bill Moyers, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." And indeed he did. In the 1964 presidential election, months later, Barry Goldwater won the popular vote in 5 Southern states after implementing the first rendition of the Southern Strategy. Richard Rovere, a New Yorker journalist traveling with the Goldwater campaign, published an article 1 whole month before the '64 election. In it, Rovere expressed his mystification at Goldwater's game plan. Quote, one wondered whether the candidate really thinks of himself as a man seeking the presidency. It is unlikely that Goldwater would go around the South agitating the most brazen of its racists if he did not think that this means was justified. Still, the whole enterprise has the air not of a great political campaign, but of a great political caper. Unless all the rules have been suspended, unless Barry Goldwater knows something that Republican leaders in New York and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Illinois and Ohio and even Georgia and Florida and Texas do not know, the entire strategy is a joke. Presumably, he feels that there are some special conditions that make what his advisors call the Southern Strategy, which is using the South's electoral votes as the foundation of national Republican victory, peculiarly valid in 1964. Whatever Goldwater knew or didn't know, he pioneered the future of the Republican Party. Going around the South agitating the most brazen of its racists became a central design of Republican presidential campaigns thereafter. Goldwater opened this tradition with the necessary duplicity. He campaigned on a 2-pronged platform, promising law and order on the one hand and respect for states' rights on the other. Never did the words Negroes, whites, segregation, or civil rights cross his lips. Instead, he used code words. When he decried bullies and marauders, white audiences understood he meant blacks. When he talked about respecting states' rights, he was committing to the non-enforcement of federal civil rights. To a degree, it worked. For the first time in history, a Republican candidate won the presidential vote in the Deep South, but he lost in every other state in the Union. As Rovere wondered, what did Goldwater think he knew that would have upended the political rules of Northern Republicans? What were the special conditions that could render the Southern strategy successful? As it turns out, foibles and failures of the national security state were the as yet undeveloped necessary ingredients. In 1964, LBJ confidently predicted that the Civil Rights Act would deliver the South to the Republican Party. One might wonder, why was he so confident? The answer is in the racism that ran through his veins. In an oft-quoted passage from Robert Caro's biography of LBJ, the president once asked his chauffeur, Robert Parker, whether he'd prefer to be called by his name rather than boy, nigger, or chief. Parker replied, yes, he would, at which point Johnson grew angry and said, as long as you are black, and you're going to be black till the day you die, no one's going to call you by your goddamn name. So no matter what you are called, nigger, you just let it roll off your back like water, and you'll make it. Just pretend you're a goddamn piece of furniture. Passing the Civil Rights Act was political calculation engendered by JFK's belated support for it and combined with his assassination. While LBJ championed it in public, privately, he remained guarded and scurrilous in his thinking. The historian Doris Kearns Goodwin describes him as having offered this counsel to Southern colleagues. These Negroes, they're getting pretty uppity these days. And that's a problem for us, since they've got something now they never had before. The political pull to back up their uppityness. Now we've got to do something about this. We got to give them a little something, just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference. For if we don't move at all, then their allies will line up against us, and there'll be no way of putting a brake on all sorts of wild legislation. It'll be Reconstruction all over again. This ugly, duplicitous, half-hearted posture of Democrats was the beginning of a long slide into spinelessness. The resounding addition sealing that fate came in their subservience to the national security state. President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law on July 2nd, 1964. 1 month later, on August 10, 1964, the president signed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, formally opening the public phase of the Vietnam War. Unbeknownst to the American people and to many members of Congress, the United States had been covertly fighting in Vietnam for over 10 years. A CIA covert operations plan launched earlier in 1964 that sent commando raids into North Vietnam had been failing to deliver desired results. In July, the newly appointed commander of covert operations for the Department of Defense, called the U.S. Military Assistance Command, decided to switch tactics from ground assaults to shore bombardments using mortars and rockets fired from patrol boats. On August 2nd, North Vietnamese patrol boats set out to defend against a shore bombardment. They failed to locate the offending boats, but they did come across the USS Maddox, 12 miles offshore on a reconnaissance patrol for the CIA. The North Vietnamese boats fired 2 torpedoes at the Maddox. Both missed. 2 days later, in rainy and foggy conditions, the Maddox reported a second attack to the high command in Pearl Harbor, which passed the report to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. However, after 45 minutes, the ship commander called off his counterattack, realizing that he had been shooting at phantoms. Faulty sonar had been showing boats where none existed. Nevertheless, the report of a second attack prompted McNamara to persuade Johnson that the time for open retaliation was at hand. The president went on television at 9:35 that night to announce his, quote, positive reply to North Vietnam. Hours later, 18 Navy jets bombed an oil depot outside of Hanoi. The North Vietnamese shot down one of the jets, killing its pilot. 3 days later, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The unbelievable volume of lies, distortions, and fantasies employed in the war against Vietnam did not become known to the American people for 7 years, until publication of the leaked documents that came to be called the Pentagon Papers in June 1971, which set in motion a long parade of chicanery directed by President Nixon, first to plumb the leaks that occasioned the Pentagon Papers, second to punish the leakers, and third to safeguard against any further episodes that might tarnish his re-election chances in 1972. A motley group of old CIA contractors assembled into the Plumbers, and their sloppy spying led them into the Watergate building on the night of June 17, 1972, where they were caught red-handed, bugging the Democratic Party headquarters. 2 years later, Nixon resigned the presidency. As a young man witnessing these events, I remember marking the first sea change of the Watergate era as society's acceptance that the president lies. That single fact was debated on television, in schoolrooms, bars, and kitchens around the country until John Dean testified to its unavoidable truth. A subsequent Senate investigation run by Senator Frank Church made it clear that the whole government lies, the CIA, the Pentagon, defense contractors, presidents, and by admission, at the least, congresspeople, including Frank Church. That transformation opened a wide path to general cynicism in the American body politic, a cynicism directly connected to the post-war decision to be a hoarder of weapon secrets, enforced by covert actions and plausible deniability. Meanwhile, the passive racism emblazoned in LBJ's counsel to fellow Democrats to give Black Americans a little something, just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference, spread like cancer through the party. Since the Civil Rights Act, Democrats have been saddled with rhetorical support for Blacks undermined by extraordinary reluctance to take consequential action. School desegregation languished into the 1970s. The practice of mortgage discrimination, called redlining, that effectively trapped Blacks into the poorest neighborhoods throughout America by denying them credit for homes elsewhere, remains in place. Though officially outlawed in 1968, a 2018 study of residential patterns and housing discrimination showed that 3 out of 4 neighborhoods redlined in the past remain impoverished and their residents overwhelmingly Black. Living standards, job opportunities, healthcare, wages, and a host of indices demonstrate that racial discrimination today is omnipresent. The Democratic Party, which has claimed itself the champion and defender of Black Americans for 58 years, has instead proven itself essentially a party of words without actions. Republicans have been gleeful throughout and have taken robust advantage. In 68 and again in 72, Nixon honed Goldwater's Southern strategy of coded racial appeals. Nixon campaigned on law and order and a war on drugs, signaling his intent to crack down on race riots, anti-war demonstrations, and the redlined Black populations of inner cities. He promoted benign neglect with regard to enforcing federal rights. The openly segregationist Senator Strom Thurmond assured voters that if elected, Nixon promised that he won't enforce either the Civil Rights or Voting Rights Acts. Stick with Nixon. And white voters did. In 1980, Reagan added Cadillac driving Black welfare queens to the catalog of racist tropes. 8 years later, George Bush Sr. plied the image of a marauding Willie Horton into victory. In year 2000, his son, a Connecticut born and bred National Guard deserter, used a Texas-flavored evangelical states' rights platform and the help of Republican judges on the Supreme Court to enter the presidency. And Trump, we'll get to him in a minute, but there's one other set of events I'd like to outline. As mentioned briefly above, the feckless procession of misdeeds and blunders summoned by Nixon to shore up national security leaks tumbled into the Watergate upending. It was the first moment after World War II in which public disclosure of national security secrecy and lies turned back policies by then decades in the making. To wit, the United States inelegantly stopped fighting the war in Vietnam. The hippies and the Panthers and all those who stood against Nixon were elated, encouraged, emboldened. The business community was disgusted, Wall Street jittery, and the military-industrial complex straight out mad. A lengthy memo written by a tobacco industry defense lawyer to the National Chamber of Commerce in August 1971, expressed this simmering corporate outrage and was quietly passed from boardroom to boardroom to become the blueprint for a reactionary crusade. The memo opened, "No thoughtful person can question that the American economic system is under broad attack. The sources are varied and diffused. They include, not unexpectedly, the communists, new leftists, and other revolutionaries who would destroy the entire system. Business must learn the lesson that political power is necessary, that such power must be assiduously cultivated, and that when necessary, it must be aggressively used with determination, without embarrassment, and without reluctance, the reluctance which has been so characteristic of American business. Under our constitutional system, especially with an activist-minded Supreme Court, the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change." 4 months later, Nixon appointed the author of that memo, Lewis Powell, to the Supreme Court, marking the first step in a now 58-year offensive to install an activist-minded Supreme Court dedicated to the corporate domination promoted in Powell's memo. The Powell memo generated many other political enterprises. Conservative billionaires invented a new kind of think tank. The new models were activist, overtly political, openly partisan, and confidently disingenuous. One of the first such think tanks was the Heritage Foundation, funded by Richard Mellon Scaife and Charles Koch. Its first director, Paul Weyrich, a self-described Christian radical, is characterized by the journalist Kurt Anderson as having, quote, "madly dreamed of returning America to the past in all ways." Anderson continues, "He sincerely wanted business unregulated and the rich untaxed and government minimized. And he sincerely pined for an explicitly Christian culture bordering on theocracy, where women didn't have equal rights and racial segregation was considered okay." At the end of his career, Weyrich recalled that his early vision for the Heritage Foundation was to fuse evangelicals with the Republican Party in order to amass a so-called moral majority, marshaled behind conservative causes. His first efforts in that vein involved appeals to evangelicals about pornography, prayer in schools, the Equal Rights Amendment, even abortion, but none took hold. Then he came upon a 1971 US District Court ruling, Green versus Connolly, which withdrew tax exemption from private Christian schools practicing segregation. Private Christian academies had proliferated vastly in the South to avert and subvert public school desegregation. They categorically did not admit Black students. Weyrich saw an opportunity in the Green v. Connolly decision to decry not the federal enforcement of desegregation, but instead a federal attack on freedom of religion, as in the freedom of Christian schools to practice racism. His artifice got the attention of a nearby evangelical leader in Lynchburg, Virginia, named Jerry Falwell, whose Christian academy had received a letter from the IRS inquiring into the school's racial policies. Falwell and Weyrich joined forces to organize the evangelical network to resist desegregation through the manipulation of coded phrasing. Just as, yes, just as Nixon and Goldwater had done. Having established that bond, Weyrich returned to the issue of abortion which promised a far bigger constituency. The pro-life movement began, and a moral majority soon blossomed in the flotsam of duplicitous phrasing. Money, commitment, and contrivance characterize a Republican Party whose brain trust centers on cultural politics with the apparent objective of reshaping America into the society of Paul Warwick's dreams, a virtual Christian theocracy within which racism is embraced and sexism expected. But the deeper goal of these cultural politics is embedded in the Powell Memo. In 1971, corporate capitalism was under broad attack, according to Powell. And to survive, businessmen had to be trained and equipped, quote, to conduct guerrilla warfare with those who propagandize against the system. Cultural politics have been a tool of guerrilla warfare paid for and orchestrated by the billionaire class, but the deeper goal has been the bolstering of corporate capitalism, and it has worked. Corporations are as powerful as trusts in the Gilded Age and are just as unaccountable. Citizens have been turned into consumers. Politics have been turned into transactions. Throughout the transformation, Republicans have used racism as the primary motivational agent, while Democrats stand idly by, using platitudes, but never really telling the truth. And then along came Trump. In a 2018 book titled The Road to Unfreedom, Yale historian Timothy Snyder writes that, quote, Russia raised a creature of their own to the presidency of the United States. Trump was the payload of a cyber weapon meant to create chaos and weakness, as in fact he has done. Snyder's analysis is scary reading. He continues, throughout the exercise, Russia knew what was fact and what was fiction. Russia knew Trump for what he was, not the very successful businessman of his tweets, but an American loser who became a Russian tool. Although Americans might dream otherwise, no one who mattered in Moscow believed that Trump was a powerful tycoon. Russian money had saved him from the fate that would normally await anyone with his record of failure. What Trump was then, he is now, and that is a narcissist of sociopathic proportions who taps into the dynamic of his disorder to lead others down a primrose path of imagined greatness. And that imagined greatness is defined by American racism, secrecy, and lies. The racism is certainly obvious, from Mexican marauders reviled in the 2016 campaign to the good people in Charlottesville who pummeled and killed in 2017 while shouting, Jews will not replace us, to the Confederate flag wavers in the Capitol on January 6th, shouting Pence's head in the name of Trump. White nationalism is the defining descriptor of ideology embraced by the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and others who proclaim allegiance to Trump. It's important to recognize that Trump wasn't always so racist and misogynist. Bill and Hillary Clinton went to his 2005 wedding to Melania. He donated regularly to Planned Parenthood throughout the 90s. He is today what he has been all throughout his life, whatever it takes to propel himself to center stage. Republican politics since 1964 have required racism to galvanize a white working class base. Trump's talent is excess, and he has pushed the envelope of racism to a new low. Secrecy is the underappreciated factor in Trump's rise to power. Since passage of the National Security Act in 1947, members of the federal government, be they politicians or staff, have been held to an oath of secrecy that prohibits public discussion and consideration of all things classified with regard to the infinitely vague and ever-expanding realm of security. Corporations, euphemistically called defense contractors, or more directly, members of the military-industrial complex, have profited so enormously from the federal dollars streamed their way in military budgets that officially top $1 trillion and unofficially turn into far more, that they have become and are dependent. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Chrysler, Halliburton, Koch Industries, to name a few, would not be anything like they are without those federal tax dollar subsidies. Those subsidies are the fuel that keep the motor of the American economy running. The rules of the national security state prohibit democratic consideration. Corporate leaders in the military-industrial complex delight in those rules, which safeguard their revenue flows at least as much as they safeguard national defense. While both Republicans and Democrats play by the rules, the historic circumstances of what some argue was the overdetermined war in Vietnam have, since that time, tarnished the Democratic Party with having lost the war. At the same time, Democrats took on the mantle of defending civil rights for Blacks, immigrants, and all Americans, a challenge they were and remain only half ready to assume. Richard Nixon pounced on that double vulnerability and succeeded where Barry Goldwater had not in rendering the Southern strategy defined as Rovere defined it, as using the South's electoral votes as the foundation of national Republican victory. Secrecy and failures of the national security state delivered the presidency to Nixon. The use of racism has been embedded in the Republican Party ever since. But more consequential has been the leakage of secrets in 1971 rendered into the Pentagon Papers that occasioned national self-doubt, recrimination, Nixon's blunders, and ultimate resignation. Corporate leaders in and out of the military-industrial complex reacted fiercely. The Powell memo was a declaration of war on the hippies, the activists, universities, and the media. It was a declaration of war on the organs of society most informed by reason, facts, and truth. Millionaires and billionaires built think tanks, lobby groups, a Federalist Society, and the American Legislative Exchange Council to suborn reason, facts, and ultimately the truth with deceptive entreaties to freedom of religion and specious attestations of corporate personhood. They have put chains on democracy to root corporate domination into every fiber of the body politic. And they have done so not just duplicitously, but with lies. Fox News lies daily and with impunity. Lies made Trump possible. The lie that Barack Obama was not born in the United States opened his candidacy. Why did Barack Obama act so quietly and calmly to that lie? Why did he not sue Trump for defamation? Why in 2004 did John Kerry let himself get swift-boated? That is, not defend himself against the Republican lies about his service in Vietnam. What is it about Democrats that they not only don't tell the truth, but submit themselves to Republican lies? It's in the culture. It's where the money is at. Corporations pay for federal politicians. Only a few escape the tentacles of their corporate coffers. Bernie Sanders is one of them, and still even he only tells half the truth. Racism, secrecy, and lies paved the way for Trump by busting the force of factuality, building a movement of climate denial, alienating Americans from their government and sense of agency. Into that gaping hole walked a red-headed bloviator with undeniable Russian help and severe psychological condition that has conformed to the insecurities of our time. We have met the enemy, and he is us. Thank you.
So now, as we always do in these forums, excuse me, I'd like to open it up to discussion, and Nick will field questions.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if you want to ask a question, first turn on your mute button or turn it off, and then let's see how it goes.
I got a question, Nick.
Go ahead, Ned.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. Very well done. It's great to hear you. And my thing that I've been thinking about is what it kind of goes back to whether are humans good or are they not good? And it applied to this country. Is it like, is half the country, because we're in a situation now, the one you described, and you described a lot about the agency and the strategies of leaders that that sort of have been able to take advantage of maybe the uneducated or ignorant, whatever. But is it maybe that a lot of people in this country aren't good people, and that the government is like in a situation where a lot of them are going, that's fine, it works for us. But where you have a lot of people who are actually really are racist without the help of the government. And they really are very happy to hate people and just, be with their own people. Like that's the thing that I think is really tough for this country, and probably for Democrats. And I agree with you, just our tongue tied, is like, what if the country is composed of a lot of bad people? And what do you do? Because that's like in democracy. If you got a lot of bad people saying, no, this is the way I feel. No, I'm not moral, and that's fine. I don't go by the Judeo-Christian tradition. I don't think truth is important. I really, this is all things that we've inherited, but I think, really it's every man, I'm going to just think what I want, and I don't care if I hate people. What if half the country's like that? That's who they are. That's who we are. We voted for Trump.
Here. Yeah. So, okay. So Ned just asked, what if half of the American people are in fact so honestly racist that, that is not really changeable, and we're in a democracy, so we have to let them continue to be racists. So what are we to do, right? On that, I mean, how do you, but see, so Ned, point one would be racism is really not legal.
Right,
Right.
but they don't care.
Right, they don't care.
They reject Washington. Washington never has done anything for them. Did nothing. Washington is so alienated from the people who voted for Trump, a lot of them, that the bases that he put together, because he put together like a plurality, a whole bunch of bases. And a lot of them, the people are like, no, I don't think Washington has anything to do with anything. They were going to go along with Trump throwing the Constitution out and having a despotism. Like a leader that was on their side, a single leader.
Okay, so, so we're all in this democratic moment here. Wait a second.
Yes.
What's, your name is?
Brino,
No.
I
Please, you're quite,
I'm pleased that Beth, who I don't think is Beth, but he hasn't put up his actual name for
Oh, I
us
see.
to know.
I'm Ned, I'm sorry. That's it's my
I
one.
think that Ned brings up a really, really important point, but I would like to put it in a different cant it in a different way. You speak of what if half of us are bad people based on the fact that we're racist and acting on our racist beliefs. And I want to expand the perspective that is a more psychological look at what Nicholas has described very technically based on our political inaction, blindness. The history was fascinating and spot on as far as what I know, but we have been a racist nation our entire time.
Exactly.
All of us are racist. Some of us try hard not to act in racist ways. However, all of us present to varying degrees have done little or nothing, or maybe attempted more. Tim Kipp, as a history teacher, probably has done the most. I don't know what any of you have done, but how much have we white, educated, good people done to take the life out of our racist? We've drunk the tea, Kool-Aid. We've drunk the racist Kool-Aid. We've grown up in a racist culture. We need to look at our whiteness, and we need to move into a space where white people start to help other white people not be racist, particularly older people helping younger white people shift towards rationalism and away from extremism. So I've taken this out of the political realm and put it into the personal realm, but I think the two intersect for what it's worth.
Thank you, Greeno, for those comments. I think they are absolutely relevant to to this historic struggle that we're in. A couple of things I would like to respond first to. Ned? Is that half of us are not overtly defined, should not be defined as racist. First of all, we're going by a mass media analysis that said that half the people supported Trump. Well, in fact, that's not true. It's probably as bad as this is, it's better than what the 0.5% or 50%. And that is that about 20, maybe 30% of voter age population, those that were 18 or over, actually voted for Trump. So you could say perhaps that they were certifiably in one form or another racist, although I wouldn't characterize it that way either. I think there's a lot more other factors, class factors, that play into what creates the attitudes and the ideology and the motivations to vote for who they vote for. Desperation is certainly one. The great class divides, the income inequality, and so forth. We all know these things pretty well. But I would not discount, and don't get me wrong in this, I wouldn't discount whatsoever what Reno's saying about the prevalence of, and what Nick is saying about the prevalence of racism. And if we don't recognize that, then we are totally going to be lost in that swamp forever. And we can look throughout our history, as bad as it is, those exciting times that we've had, Reconstruction, Black Reconstruction after the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement for all its weaknesses, were advances. What this country does, we advance and then we retrench. We advance and we retrench. And I think we historically have done that. So whenever there's progressive movement, there's also a backlash. And I think because, and I want to simplify this, but because of corporate power in a culture of political economy that's defined by the money and politics and corporations, they have more power. They have more voice, they have more votes, they have more of the agenda. And Nick was very clear on that in his seamless weaving of a tapestry of all of these powerful forces after World War II up to today, which gave us the logical consequence of Donald Trump.
Garrett, what do you got?
A little further in that direction, if my mic is working, from the psychological to the biological. If you look at people as organisms or animals, and you look at their nervous systems, you see that, in particular, the autonomic nervous system, arousal and calming, right, the two polarities, functions such that when we feel under threat, we become almost different people from when we're not perceiving ourselves as under threat. And when we're under threat, or when we perceive that, we filter out any evidence to the contrary, and we see only threats, right? And when we're secure, we don't. If you look back in history, America was founded, or let's not say America, the people coming from Europe, call them what you might, came into a land of plenty. They didn't count the Indians as people, of course. So they had a lot of stuff. They had infinite resources, and that birthed a spirit of generosity in a sense, right? So they were not under threat except from the Indians and from the different cultures of Europe. And under that circumstance, you get a different type of outlook and a different type of person, maybe a less bad person, although they were plenty bad in many instances. So in that sense, capitalism and the scarcity, which was in Europe at the time of the Enlightenment and at the time of the people coming to this country, which was a terrifying time in Europe, right? Those people were terrified. They were starving, they were hungry, they were brutalized by religion and by all the structures of hierarchy. It's gone on ever since, so that we're not secure and we perceive other people as threats and don't perceive the possibilities of generosity and kindness and so on. And I could add one more point to that, which is that we also like to play to our group, and the media politics plays to that, and they manipulate our sense of group, the chorus, which we like to be accepted by. We all like to be liked, right? Academics like to be liked by academics. Country people like to be liked by country people, and so on. And so it's quite easy to manipulate that sense of belongingness by people who know what they're doing, and they do know what they're doing. So I guess what I'm saying, Ned, is that I don't think people are essentially bad, but they can be what you're calling bad when they see themselves as threatened. That's about what I'm trying to say. Human nature, I think, is very variable. End of pitch.
I agree with that.
Thanks. Who's next? Anybody else? Oh, would you like to say something? Yeah.
Yes. I guess in our conversation, and thank you so much for your eloquent talk that was so well researched and had such a nice line, very helpful. I was thinking more from the perspective of culture. You know, Abbie Hoffman said before he died that without a true culture shift, there can't be a successful revolution or revolutionary change. And I really believe that, of course, the antics and all the things that were done to test American culture and to play with it and mess with it and look at it for, you know, its schisms and its contradictions. One of the things that's interesting to me is when we think about racism and the other isms, I mean, there's so many of them in that are operant in the state right now. And I guess what I think about is when we look at demographics, white privilege and the fact that we're privileged with our education. Essentially, we're intellectuals that have the capacity to reflect through our critical thinking on all these historical and political questions. To me, that's the answer of the 50%, or why did all these people vote for Trump or whatever. There's our drinking the Kool-Aid of racism, but also our privilege, the privilege to be able to do critical thinking. So, for example, Chris Hedges and Death of the Liberal Class, that book, and really looking at the evolution, as you really pointed out very well, of how the liberal tradition of being able to think in critical terms has really, really been evaporated in a very, very systematic way. So that's a funny thing, because I'm a New Englander and I've lived in every New England state. I just returned here from Georgia after 7 years. I'm excited to announce from the town of Newt Gingrich and the district of John Ossoff and in Marietta, Georgia, home of Lockheed Martin. And I had someone who got me a security clearance so I could go past each fighter jet with each NATO flag in front of it, whether built or completed, rolling off the assembly line. A horrible, horrible experience for someone, even having, once upon a time been in the military. I digress. That aspect of critical thinking, we make the assumption that there's people all over the United States that have the capacity to analyze information and not be influenced by the security state and corporations and media. And coming back from the South, as I have a number of different times before, the private Christian education, all those little vessels of culture and the way that people were brought up to think the way they think and to be influenced the way they are. Finally, what I'd like to say is what really fascinates me, though, in this culture question, and if there's an embedded question of is change possible here, or why are people so damn ignorant? To me, the fascinating thing now is that climate change and the hellscape of what's happening with our climate right now, that's not an issue of race. That's not really an issue of power. It may be an issue of definitely fear, trauma, but why is it that even when the odds are so grave, that people who have the capacity to think critically will not do anything? I think it's very, very fascinating, even from the perspective of the liberal thinker with the capacity to think critically. So here I am back in New England, and that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I would like to respond to that last point you made about climate change. That's absolutely a question of control and power. It's absolutely a corporate driven question that links interwoven unbelievably with the military and industrial complex, because how do they defend themselves? All those jets you see, what do they fly on? And if they don't have that oil, then they can't have the army 3 times bigger than the rest of the world. And they have all these alliances, all these dependencies. So no corporation is going to go for climate change while the United States is the, empire, defending itself and all the good guys. And that's a point that nobody talks to. Again, because of secrecy and the national security state rules, Bernie Sanders can't talk about that. In fact, he supported F-35s in Burlington, and actually that's a destructive, hugely destructive, way to go.
I remember when he was describing this is early on, I think this was in 90, 91, when he was first in Congress, and he was wanted to find out about the covert budget. So he described the process to me. There's an armed guard by a small room with a computer, and you can go in, because it used to be you wouldn't even get to know it. So you can go in, and then your videotape and so forth. If any of that information that you just received is brought to light, you are guilty of treason. And he described doing that, and then describing that to me. Yeah.
And so it's that we've locked ourselves in as human beings to something that's They have the guns, they have the bombs, they have the planes, they have the, we don't. And,
Well, when you
as
started
Lenin
and you-
said,
When you spoke to the missing trillions of dollars.
Yeah,
It
right.
kind of says it all from the very
Yes,
beginning,
right.
and then just within the last couple of weeks, we have these expenditures, these out of control expenditures, and,
Yeah.
they're not exactly tracking where where some of those weapons are going, so those black markets, we know that they exist, and a lot of people, but anyways, yeah, culture is an interesting thing, but why are people not even acting autonomously around the climate? You have
Yes.
somebody like Jim McHenry down in Pennsylvania posting on Facebook, climate protests on the street corner in Gettysburg every week for however many times.
Yeah.
By himself, he's the only one.
Yeah.
Nobody responds.
And we
So
don't get,
where's the revolutionary spirit? It's here, I guess.
yes.
Woody,
Hey,
where's
Nick.
revolution?
Nick, I'll squeeze in a remark
Yeah, Raj,
from the equator.
yeah.
First of all, thanks for such a wide-ranging and well-organized talk. That was really enjoyable. I liked it a lot. But whenever you and I get together, which isn't frequently enough, and when I think about these kind of things that you guys are all talking about up there, I always think we're getting the revolution. We're just not getting the revolution that we hoped for. You got to hand it to the Republicans, damn it. They've been working on this stuff for 40, 50, 60 years. And they got it together better than us liberals and Democrats did. I hate to admit that, but I think we all know it's true. But just a couple, if I can read my own notes here. You touched on some of the issues around evangelism and Christianity and the makeup of all of that's been happening and that you're talking about here. And going back to the comment from, I think it was Ned, about good people, bad people, it's just like so much of this stuff seems to ride on religious fervor and evangelism and love of Christianity or claims of Christianity. Yet so many people, and I'm not a Christian, so I can't say that I know exactly what Christians are supposed to be like, but we're taught that Christians are good people, that Christians are meant to love each other and to take care of one another. And, we don't see a lot of that from a lot of people who are claiming themselves to be Christians. And the other thing that always comes to my mind, and I'm preparing a visit for the first time in 3 years to the United States next week. And I am wondering whatever happened to the concept of common good, where we really just kind of look out for one another, and we want to have good communities, and we want to accept people of all stripes and colors and mindsets and everything like that, like back when America was great again. So that's my 2 cents.
Good luck with the culture shock.
Yeah, right.
Although what you're describing, of course, has been an evolution or de-evolutionary process in terms of that loss of community and atomization and alienation. That is anti-human, my view.
And the onset of the digital age has created a whole new layer of wealth that's born of us all being atomized inside of these phones. And and everybody has stories about that as well. And when I quoted Tim Snyder, Trump ran everything out of Twitter. It's just insane to think about how how powerful that amounts to, what that honestly really fully, means. We know that he had, in his 30 million followers, he had 100,000 bots, I mean, and we can know that, kind of like we can know about that we're going to all burn up or freeze or drown from climate crisis. And yet, what are we going to do? What are we going to do?
So we choose these little battles,
Yeah.
whatever it is. It's restorative justice, homeless vets, and stuff that I'm working.
Yeah. Sanity.
Yeah, everybody needs to plant a garden or an orchard and just say the heck with the rest of you.
Come on up to Vermont.
Dr. Pandora.
Come on down to Ecuador.
As soon as I can.
All right.
So what time is it?
Well, I would like to offer something else, which is there are, I'm sure, most of us in this room, Tim, you've offered some of what you're doing. We are working to improve the human connections, human potential. I'm hoping that in this audience, it's a small audience, and apparently many of the people are known to the speaker. But I found out about it in the newspaper, so there's just a little plug for the newspaper.
Yay.
But we've talked about the isms, the things that separate us. Please don't forget, gentlemen, that the issue of misogynism is very healthy in our American culture, in the consumerism, on the internet. And if any of us elders, and many of us in the room are elders, can work to support, I used the word rational before, but now I'll introduce the word, a loving, connected, respectful quality in others, particularly those younger than us, that will pay off. That will help. So,
And Reno, it keeps us going,
yes,
right?
yes,
Yes.
it's a discouraging time if we're not building
Yeah. Yep.
the human community.
Yep.
Do people, what do people think of the possibility that young people might be less imbued with all this crap that we grew up in? They do seem to be a bit racist, at least a lot of them, and a little bit less allied with the military-industrial complex and some of the stuff that it's taken me anyway a lifetime to try and get out of my head.
We'll respond to that.
Well, I agree that that's, the case. I based on young people I do know and witnessing children and grandchildren, we all wonder, how much cataclysm does it take for the actual social structure to bend in the correct direction? And many young people are less racist, less misogynist, less prejudiced in all which way. But they also haven't had to get out and get a job and have a child yet, and all sorts of steps that took away a lot of our autonomy and open behavior. So is there time? Do we have time? All that kind of stuff.
I have, in my profession has kept me an optimist. Having worked with young people for 39 years directly in the classroom and on the streets too, has kept me optimistic. now that I'm retired,
Mm,
interesting, I'm not as optimistic. And I know it was young people that were teaching me. And I don't have enough exposure to them anymore. And I'm feeling that. In terms of that, directly to that question, I still am optimistic. I still think this generation is a lot better off in terms of their attitudes about life, in terms of the ideology, in terms of caring and so forth, than certainly my generation was, or subsequent generations over the years. So so I still retain that kind of optimism. And as I said, I don't have any other choice. You know, I'm not going to let the bastards win. I'm going to die trying to beat them.
Well, not to sound as if I'm obsessed with the as I am. I mean, that's the background that I come from, and working with young people too. And, you know, that trauma model for acceptance of climate demise right now for young people is radical acceptance, processing, dealing with all the multiple feelings that it brings up of helplessness, immobility, powerlessness. And then after that radical acceptance, then community and a call to action. And so that's to what you were saying about young people, optimism or skepticism. Again, to me, it comes back to when, you know, our job is to help to get them to that point and ourselves to that point, to a call for action. I think that they can do the rest, but there's an added layer of trauma that I see, whether spoken, whether, you know, covert or overt with young people. It's hard enough for us to talk about it as adults. You know, there is a hellscape right now, and either there's a sense of community or a call to action. So mutual aid, you know, and frankly, you know, what I believe is militant anarchism is really how we're going to help each other. You know?
And anarchism in the true sense of the
Yes,
word,
yes,
not the misuse.
that's right. It's an oft misused word.
Yeah, mostly.
Yeah, like every day on TV.
Yes.
Well, it's closing time, folks. Thanks so much for,
Nick, if we had
wait.
5 more minutes, I think.
Thanks, Nick.
but Tim is sure though, that if we had 5 more minutes, we get it all done. So. Yeah.
So Nick, thank you so much for
Yeah,
this.
thank everybody.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you guys out there.
And inch by inch, row by row. March our garden grow. And that's what we're doing.
We'll see you soon there.
Yeah, Nick, very good. Enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thanks, Raj. Thanks, Reno.
Thanks, Nick. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
good night.
All right, Wood, you got anything you want to say?
Yeah, I'd just like to say it's great to be back in a Democracy Forum meeting. It's heartening to hear this discussion and to know that there are members of the public who are concerned and are trying to keep the struggle alive. And well, I really appreciate it. And thanks so much.
Yes.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night.